Okay, so now we're going to look at a text from St. Mark's Gospel, the text of the man with the withered hand. Just before we look at it, I'd just like to point out something which you will notice. I'm not going to be treating the text as though it was a discrete whole, just to be read out loud and left at that. I'm going to be attempting to suggest to you that each of these gospel texts that we're going to be looking at is something much more like a dummy's guide to how to explain what Jesus was doing. It's much more like a series of notes that it's expected that the person who's telling the story will use so as to remind him how to tell the story, so as to teach her what she's got to look at in order to explain the thing better. Each of these texts is, if you like, contains within it a set of allusions so as to enable the person to expound what's going on. That's what we'll be looking at now in this text from very early in St. Mark's Gospel. So I'm going to give you a copy. Each one will now have a copy of the text. There we go. So we can see what's going on. Remember, this is, as it were, this is the Cliff's Notes of the story. So, again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And they watched him to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Well, when you first hear that, it sounds as though it might just be a miracle story. Jesus works a miracle on the Sabbath, the Pharisees get annoyed, end of story. But in fact, read in this way, the story is rather odd, since it makes the reaction of the Pharisees altogether over the top. Why should they react so badly? I mean, even if you have very strict views on what ought to be done or not done on certain days, really to get so worked up about someone who was manifestly in a bad way being made better seems awfully mean-spirited. So getting really worked up and threatening to destroy him for having done something like that, it suggests that really something's being missed in our easy reading of the story. You know, it makes it sound as though the Pharisees are some sort of wily coyote whose job it is to be stage baddies who are always going to get screwed by the roadrunner, and that, you know, each Sabbath will useful stage baddies hang around waiting for some miracle work so they can get angry and storm off, and then meep, the roadrunner will sort out on each occasion. It's a parody. It makes the Pharisees out in a parody. I don't think that I don't think it helps us understand what's really going on here. I once showed this passage to a rabbi who wasn't at all familiar with the New Testament, and he picked up the references which are hidden within the text immediately, which suggests to me that the rabbinical learning style, the way rabbis or trainee rabbis are taught to read texts, gives them a very good sense of exactly the kind of style of writing that's going on here. So let's see what's really at work, if you like, in the allusions in the texts, to see that it's something much more interesting than wily coyote. So let's start again at the beginning. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And they watched him to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. So here we are. We're prepared for a liturgical gathering. The man with the withered hand is not asking to be healed. He's just there, maybe hoping for a healing, maybe not. The Pharisees are keen to see how Jesus copes with the situation. They're using, if you like, the man with the withered hand as a kind of a test. What's he going to do? They want to see if they can accuse Jesus. The word for accuse is in Greek, it's the same word as the word which is at the root of our word categorize. They want to see if they can put him into a box, which is what we do when we categorize someone into it. Say, aha, we've got you. So Jesus, what we're going to see now is whether Jesus manages to avoid being put in a box, accused by them. So Jesus says to the man with the withered hand, come here. Jesus accepts the implicit challenge which he can read from the situation. And he calls out the man with the withered hand. It's as if he's saying to him, you're being set up by these, your compatriots. They want to make of you a test case. They're not really interested in your having a withered hand or not. They're only interested in you in as far as you serve their purpose of being a source of accusation to me. I'm going to do something rather grand with you. You're going to end up much, much better than you thought. You're not merely going to be their kind of stage prop to see whether they can get me. I'm going to take them at that and turn you into something rather more. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show what teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath is really all about. So, Jesus says to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? So he turns to the gathering and he does to them what they thought they were doing to him. In other words, puts them on the spot. And he does so by means of a difficult question. If they were to answer the question, it would put them in a queasy position because it would, if you like, show up their trap. Let's see what they would have understood from the tricky question. You see, in the book of Deuteronomy, a text which was absolutely central to the whole Jewish project of becoming the people of God, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses teaches the law to the people. And there are several key moments of punctuation in the text of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is presented as Moses making a speech, teaching the law to the people who are gathered. In fact, it's the archetypical synagogue meeting in which Moses teaches the law to the people. But there are several moments of punctuation in the book of Deuteronomy where Moses draws breath, as it were, and gets everyone present to assent to what he's teaching them. Having explained everything, he then says, and what are you going to do about this? Do you sign up to this? So he puts them on the spot, as it were. So the two of these moments in which Moses draws breath are very well-known passages which any adult male, any Jewish adult male would have known, and any modern adult Jewish male knows as well. These are key texts, one of which is found roughly in the middle of the book of Deuteronomy, and one rather close to the end. These are the passages. Here's Deuteronomy 11. Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I command you this day, to go after other gods which you have not known. So that's one moment. So he's saying, I'm putting before you a blessing and a curse. The whole point of this law, two ways. It's opening up a way of obedience, which is good, and a way of disobedience, which is bad. Then, towards the very end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says the following. See, I have set before you this day life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his ordinances, then you shall live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you're entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you this day that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land which you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. So, Jesus is doing what should be happening on a Sabbath liturgy. He's reenacting Moses for them. It's as though he's saying to them, okay guys, so Moses' law prohibits certain things on the Sabbath. But here we are, celebrating the Sabbath by reenacting Moses. and here we have someone with a withered hand. Well, I'm putting before you a choice in exactly the same way as Moses did, because any attempt to reenact Moses always is going to involve a choice. The blessing if you obey, and the curse if you disobey. And obeying means pursuing life and good. Disobeying means pursuing death and evil. So here you are. Are you really celebrating the Sabbath according to Moses? If you are, you will certainly want me to choose life and good. And if you are not, then who are you to accuse me of disobeying the law of Moses? As you can imagine, this is an annoying question. Those gathered were not really expecting to have Moses reenacted by this radical interpretation. By radical, I mean one that goes back to the roots in their midst. It's an uncomfortable reminder to them that Moses too requires interpretation, and that he himself offers exactly this interpretative principle. Are you going to do good or do evil, to choose life or to choose death? One of the things you can't really do when faced with Moses is to say, I will obey the commandments, which means not choosing life. So he's got them in a quandary. The whole point of what Moses was about versus a particular insistence on some particular verses at a particular time. They get it at once. They know exactly what he's saying, and they're paralyzed by it. So it says, but they were silent. Very sensible reaction. That's exactly how I would react if I'd been put on the spot by somebody like that. For them, Moses was someone who they might use against him. But now, rather than retaliate at them, he's offered them real Moses as a question, insinuating that real Moses is against their Moses in a way that's perfectly clear to them. He has given them what is self-evidently an authoritative interpretation of what it looks like for Moses to teach amongst his people. So when stuck, silence is the best answer. So it says, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. Well, here we have a splendid example of a dummy's guide giveaway. That little phrase, hardness of heart. To anyone who's even slightly acquainted with the Hebrew scripture, there's one person above all others who's associated with hardness of heart. Can any of you remember who that is? The Pharaoh of Egypt. Pharaoh is always getting worked up to do something and then is being struck by hardness of heart, if you remember. God tells Pharaoh through Moses, let my people go. And every time that the Pharaoh is about to do just that, he hardens his heart, or God hardens his heart, or in some way arteriosclerosis creeps upon him, and he desists from generosity and keeps the people back in slavery. So please notice what the gospel writer is telling us that Jesus is doing when he observes the hardness of heart. Now he's acting as Moses, looking at them as though they were Pharaoh. Remember how uncomfortable this is. If you were a collection of good religious Jewish leaders, the last thing you want is for your Moses suddenly to turn round at you and look at you as though you were Pharaoh. You say, your reaction is, hey, but we're the good guys here. And suddenly you're being looked at as though you were the person who's holding the people back. So he says to them, and he says to the man, stretch out your hand. And the man stretches it out, and his hand was restored. Well, if you like, this is the moment when Jesus really does something quite terrible in the midst of his group. First of all, he's answered them a question about the law as Moses' teaching. Then he's put them in the position whereby they're made to feel as though they are Pharaoh, who are not letting the people go. But then he enacts something rather special. He says, okay, you want Moses? I'll give you real Moses. This was what he's really about. And you're a kind of a collective Pharaoh, but without the classy headgear. But now I'm going to do something even more terrible for you. By getting the man to stretch out his hand, he's created a sign, and one that they will have picked up immediately. Because another of the key texts of the book of Deuteronomy, and again, We're not talking about obscure texts. They may be obscure to us, but to every adult male, and even every bar mitzvah kid would have known these verses. This is a key line. This is how God describes himself bringing the people out of Egypt. This is what it says in Deuteronomy book 4. For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man upon the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great terrors, according to all that the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown, that you might know that the Lord is God, there is no other besides him. I hope you see what's happened. When Jesus gets the man with the withered hand to stretch out his hand, he's in fact doing something completely and instantly recognizable to his audience. He has made the man a symbol of Yahweh being a symbol of Israel being rescued by Yahweh. Yahweh has represented himself as the one who has acted by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And suddenly here we have this guy, formerly with a withered hand, who has become a living symbol of exactly that. In other words, this line has been fulfilled. To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. You can imagine the kind of impact that this causes amongst the synagogue crowd that evening. Who else could possibly be the power behind and the meaning in this newly outstretched hand and arm? So Jesus has not only interpreted the law of Moses from within, he's not only made his listeners switch place so that they find themselves having to think, oh my God, we're behaving a bit like the Pharaoh. But he's now created an indisputable sign of Yahweh acting out in their midst. So I hope we begin to see why the Pharisees might have gone out with the Herodians, guarded the Herodians and asked to destroy him, because something much, much bigger than, if you like, a little peccadillo concerning disobedience to the Sabbath law was about. He's completely upended their whole sense of who is right and who is wrong, who is good and who is bad, who is Egypt and who is Israel. And he's enacted Yahweh for them, which of course is impossible. Who could possibly enact Yahweh except Yahweh? What could be more shocking? You can see why something has happened to them that is really very disturbing indeed. It's not just a miraculous healing. It's a sign. And that's something that we're going to be looking at. A miraculous healing, if you like, a fact that simply happens, is one thing. But the fact that simply happens points to something much bigger than that. And that's what Jesus has done. He's not only done something that's good, if you like, mended a damaged member. He's turned that into an illustration of something much, much bigger happening in their midst. That's what's meant by a sign. And some people pick it up and are immediately amazed and delighted. And others realize that something much bigger than they expected has come upon them. Do you see that the Pharisees in this account, rather than being wily coyote, are being struck with a terrible question? Whoa! Do you mean to say that all along we've been making Moses our prisoner, rather than allowing God to use Moses to set us free? What Jesus has done is not merely a friendly act of making someone better on a Saturday. He's thrown into the midst of his listeners a sign, which, as they work out what it means, challenges and threatens to upend their whole understanding of goodness and righteousness. So, how might our story be turned around so that the challenge produces in us the depth of anger that we see here? We can imagine occasions. What might it be like for someone to teach in our midst in such a way that our righteousness, our sense of what's good or bad is completely altered, such that our first reaction is to go off in a rage and try to stamp out whatever it is happening in our midst. Do you see how this works?